What if the person everyone ignores holds the key to a $50 million mystery? Sarah Williams thought her photography degree was useless in the neurological ward, watching patients fade into forgotten shadows. But when she met Jim Morrison, a homeless man with advanced Alzheimer's who spoke in riddles about brushstrokes and varnish, she never imagined his trembling hands would lead her into the art world's greatest unsolved heist. Sometimes the most valuable memories aren't stored in minds that remember, but in muscles that never forget. And sometimes the people society throws away are the ones holding its most precious secrets.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
Sarah Williams stared at her reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror, adjusting her scrubs for the third time that morning. 6 months into her job at Mercy General's neurological ward, and she still felt like an imposter. Her photography degree hung uselessly on her apartment wall, while she struggled to find meaning in measuring medications and changing bedsheets. The neurological ward was a place where hope came to die slowly. Patients arrived with fragments of themselves and left with even less. Sarah had initially chosen this specialty thinking she could make a difference, but each shift felt like watching people disappear in slow motion. Her supervisor, Janet Rodriguez, barely looked up from her charts as she made assignments. "Sarah, you're taking room 314 today. Fair warning, he's our most challenging case." Room 314 housed James Morrison, though he rarely responded to any name. Age 71, found unconscious on the streets 3 months ago with no identification, no family, no history. Advanced Alzheimer's with rapid cognitive decline. The kind of patient that made other nurses uncomfortable, not because he was violent or disruptive, but because he was a living reminder of how completely a person could disappear. Sarah knocked gently before entering. The room smelled of disinfectant and something else, something that reminded her of her grandfather's art studio, though she couldn't place what. Jim sat by the window, his gray hair uncombed, wearing the standard hospital gown that made every patient look diminished. His hands moved constantly, not the random fidgeting common in dementia patients, but deliberate motions, as if you were painting invisible pictures in the air. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said softly, approaching with his morning medications. His eyes focused at her with surprising clarity. "The underpainting is wrong," he said, his voice carrying a precision that contradicted his confused medical charts. "You can't build truth on a foundation of lies." Sarah had read his file. Rambling about art was noted as a persistent delusion. Previous nurses had tried redirecting his attention or simply ignored his comments. But something about his tone made Sarah pause. "What kind of underpainting?" she asked. Jim's hands stopped moving. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You're different," he said. "The others don't listen to the canvas." Over the next few hours, Sarah found herself drawn into Jim's fragmented world. Unlike other dementia patients, whose words seemed random, his statements had an internal logic that she couldn't quite grasp. He spoke about sfumato technique and craquelure patterns with the authority of someone who had spent decades studying these concepts. During lunch break, curiosity compelled Sarah to research the terms Jim used. Sfumato was Leonardo da Vinci's technique of subtle gradations. Craquelure referred to the fine cracks that appeared in old paintings. These weren't random words. They were sophisticated art terminology. When she returned to room 314, Jim was standing at the window, his finger tracing patterns on the glass. "The light is wrong here," he murmured. "Northern light gives truer colors. That's why the masters preferred it." Sarah's photography training kicked in. He was right. Northern light was preferred by artists because it remained consistent throughout the day. But how did a homeless man with dementia know this? "Mr. Morrison, where did you learn about art?" Jim turned to her, his eyes momentarily clear. "Jim's not my name. he said, "but I can't remember what is." That afternoon, Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Instead of following standard protocol, she wheeled Jim down to the hospital's small art therapy room on the third floor. The space was barely used. Most neurological patients were too far gone to benefit from creative therapies. The room contained basic supplies: watercolors, brushes, canvas boards, and easels. Jim's entire demeanor shifted the moment they entered. His posture straightened, his wandering gaze became focused, and his hands stopped their constant motion. Sarah placed a brush in his hand. What happened next defied everything she knew about muscle memory and neurological damage. Jim's fingers gripped the brush with practiced ease. His arm moved in confident strokes across the canvas, creating shapes and shadows with an expertise that seemed impossible for someone in his condition. Within 30 minutes, he had created a small landscape that demonstrated advanced technical skill. The brushwork showed understanding of light, composition, and color theory that took years to develop. Sarah watched in fascination as Jim's hands worked independent of his conscious mind, guided by muscle memory that Alzheimer's hadn't touched. "How are you doing this?" Sarah whispered. Jim looked down at his painting as if surprised to find it there. "I don't know," he said honestly. "My hands remember what my mind forgot." Sarah photographed the painting with her phone, capturing details that revealed Jim's incredible skill. The brush strokes were confident, the color mixing sophisticated, the composition expertly balanced. This wasn't the work of someone with dementia. This was the work of a master. Over the following days, Sarah began taking Jim to the art therapy room regularly. Each session revealed more of his hidden expertise. He could identify paint brands by their texture, discuss the chemical properties of different pigments, and demonstrate techniques that even Sarah's art school friends wouldn't recognize. But Jim's lucid moments were becoming rarer. Some days he didn't remember Sarah at all. Other days he would look at his own paintings as if seeing them for the first time. The disease was progressing rapidly, erasing more of his identity each week. Sarah began documenting everything, photographing Jim's paintings, recording his scattered comments, noting the techniques he demonstrated unconsciously. Her photography background proved invaluable as she captured details that others might miss. It was during her research into art techniques that Sarah stumbled across an article that made her blood cold. The Wellington Heist. 15 years later, $50 million in masterpieces still missing. The article detailed the 1987 theft of 15 paintings from private collector Harold Wellington. The thief had shown intimate knowledge of art handling and conservation, skills that matched everything Sarah had observed in Jim. But the article revealed something else. The thief hadn't just stolen the paintings. He had left behind perfect forgeries in their place. The theft wasn't discovered for 3 years, and only then because Wellington had attempted to sell one of the pieces, and the buyer's expert examination revealed it was fake. Sarah stared at Jim's paintings with new eyes. The technical skill, the intimate knowledge of materials and techniques, the way his hands moved with practiced precision, it all pointed to one impossible conclusion. The homeless man with Alzheimer's in room 314 might be one of the most wanted art thieves in American history.
Detective Jennifer Martinez had been staring at the Wellington case files for so long that the crime scene photos seemed burned into her retinas. 15 masterpieces, including works by Monet, Degas, and Van Gogh, vanished into thin air. The forgeries left behind were so perfect that experts needed months of analysis to detect them. Whoever pulled off this heist wasn't just a thief, they were an artist of extraordinary skill. For 15 years, the case had tormented the FBI's art crime team. They had followed leads across 3 continents, interviewed hundreds of suspects, and recovered exactly nothing. The statute of limitations had long expired, but Jennifer couldn't let go. Something about the precision of the crime, the artistic mastery required, kept pulling her back. The call from Mercy General came on a Thursday afternoon. A young nurse claimed to have information about the Wellington case. Jennifer had received countless false leads over the years,
people seeking reward money or attention, but something in Sarah Williams' voice made her pay attention. He demonstrates techniques that shouldn't be possible for someone with his condition, Sarah explained as they walked through the hospital corridors. And his knowledge of art materials and conservation methods is extraordinary. Jennifer had interviewed dozens of potential suspects, but never one with advanced dementia. The legal and ethical implications were staggering. Even if Jim Morrison was the Wellington thief, his condition made him impossible to prosecute. But the families of the stolen artworks deserved answers, and the art world needed closure. Room 314 was small and sterile, nothing like the elegant crime scenes Jennifer usually investigated. Jim Morrison sat by the window, looking frail and confused. This couldn't possibly be the mastermind behind one of the most sophisticated art heists in history. "Mr. Morrison," Jennifer said gently, "I'm Detective Martinez. I'd like to talk to you about some paintings." Jim's eyes flickered with something, recognition, fear, hope. It was impossible to tell. "Paintings can lie. People think they show truth, but they only show what the artist wants you to see." Sarah led them to the art therapy room, where several of Jim's recent works were displayed. Jennifer studied them with the trained eye of someone who had spent years analyzing artistic techniques. The skill level was undeniable, but more importantly, the style showed characteristics that matched forensic analysis from the Wellington crime scene. "Could you paint something for me?" Jennifer asked Jim. Without hesitation, Jim picked up a brush and began working on a small canvas. His hands moved with confidence despite the tremor in his voice. Jennifer watched as he demonstrated techniques that were mentioned in confidential FBI reports, methods that had never been released to the public. "The varnish has to breathe," Jim murmured as he worked. "Too thick and the colors die underneath. The painting suffocates." Jennifer exchanged glances with Sarah. This specific concern about varnish application was noted in the Wellington case files. The forger had used unusual varnishing techniques that suggested deep knowledge of conservation science. Over the next hour, Jim's painting revealed details that only someone with intimate knowledge of the Wellington theft could know. He painted shadowy impressions of rooms that resembled Wellington's mansion, though distorted through the lens of memory loss. He included architectural details that had never been published in any news reports. But as Jennifer watched Jim work, a disturbing realization emerged. His comments weren't those of a thief bragging about a successful heist. They were the words of someone who genuinely cared about the paintings themselves. They were dying in that place. Beautiful things locked away where no one could see them. Art needs to be alive, needs to be appreciated. It was killing them slowly. Jennifer felt her understanding of the case shift. "Where are the paintings now, Jim?" "Safe," he said simply. "I made sure they were safe." The investigation took on new urgency as Jim's condition deteriorated rapidly. Some days he couldn't remember his own name. Other days he would paint detailed maps that seemed to reference storage locations. Sarah documented everything, her photography skills proving crucial as she captured details that might otherwise be lost. Jennifer faced an unprecedented challenge, extracting information from someone whose memories were disappearing in real time. Traditional interrogation methods were useless. Instead, she had to rely on Sarah's art therapy approach, using creative expression to unlock memories that conventional questioning couldn't reach. The breakthrough came during Jim's most lucid day in weeks. While painting a landscape that looked suspiciously like the Hudson River Valley, he began talking about the warehouse where they sleep safely. "Who sleeps safely?" Jim asked, as he created delicate figures in the landscape. "The beautiful ladies. The dancing girl in blue, the lady with water lilies, the man with the yellow hat. They're all together now, where the air is clean and the light is soft." Jennifer's pulse quickened. The dancing girl in blue could refer to Degas's ballet rehearsal, one of the stolen pieces. The lady with water lilies might be the stolen Monet. These weren't random descriptions, they were specific references to the Wellington collection. But Jim's next words stopped Jennifer cold. Harold never deserved them. He kept them in that basement like prisoners, no windows, no light, just locked away in the dark. Art dies in the dark. Jennifer realized that Jim wasn't just talking about theft, he was talking about rescue. Harold Wellington had indeed stored his collection in a climate-controlled basement with no natural light. To someone who truly loved art, this made it seem like imprisonment rather than protection. "Jim, did you save the paintings?" His eyes filled with tears. "I tried to save them all, but I couldn't save myself." That evening, Jennifer sat in her car outside the hospital, grappling with a moral dilemma her police training hadn't prepared her for. Jim Morrison appeared to be the Wellington thief, but his motive seemed to be preservation rather than profit. He had stolen not for money, but because he believed the paintings were being mistreated. More troubling was the realization that Jim was dying. His Alzheimer's was advancing rapidly, and doctors estimated he had weeks, possibly days, before his memory disappeared entirely. If the paintings were to be recovered, it had to happen soon. Sarah called Jennifer that night with devastating news. "Jim's had another episode. He doesn't remember any of our conversations about art. He doesn't even remember painting." Jennifer stared at the photos Sarah had sent of images of Jim's paintings that contained what might be the only clues to finding $50 million in stolen masterpieces. Time was running out, and with each passing hour, more of Jim's memories vanished forever. The next morning brought another shock. Jennifer arrived at the hospital to find Sarah in the art therapy room, not with Jim, but with a middle-aged woman who looked remarkably familiar. "Detective Martinez, I'd like you to meet Helen Morrison. She's Jim's daughter." Everything you thought you knew about Jim Morrison just shattered. The lonely homeless man isn't who he appeared to be, and his family connection will reveal secrets that transform this story from art heist to something much more complex and heartbreaking.
Helen Morrison sat across from Jennifer and Sarah, her hands trembling as she held a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. At 45, she bore a striking resemblance to Jim. The same intense eyes, the same delicate fingers that seemed made for creating rather than grasping. "I've been looking for him for 3 years, Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "When I saw the news report about an unidentified man found on the streets, something made me come check. I never imagined—" Jennifer studied Helen carefully. In her experience, family members of long-lost relatives usually showed relief or joy upon reunion. Helen showed only profound sadness and something else. Guilt. "Why didn't you report him missing?" Jennifer asked. Helen's laugh was bitter. "Because I'm the one who made him disappear." Sarah reached across the table, her nurse's instincts kicking in. "What do you mean?" "My father, his name is actually James Morrison Hamilton, though he dropped the Hamilton years ago, was the most brilliant art conservator I've ever known. He worked for museums, private collectors, auction houses. He could restore a damaged masterpiece so perfectly that even experts couldn't tell it had been repaired." Jennifer felt pieces clicking into place. Art conservation required many of the same skills as art forgery. Intimate knowledge of materials, techniques, and aging processes. But Dad had a problem. He couldn't stand seeing art mistreated. He would get physically ill when he saw valuable pieces stored improperly or displayed in damaging conditions. It became an obsession. Helen pulled out her phone and showed them photos from years past. James at gallery openings, James working on restoration projects, James surrounded by paintings in what appeared to be a professional workshop. He started what he called interventions. If a collector was damaging their pieces through negligence or poor storage, Dad would offer to help. Sometimes they accepted, sometimes they didn't. "And when they didn't accept?" Jennifer prompted. Helen's eyes closed. "He would take matters into his own hands." The Wellington case suddenly made perfect sense. Harold Wellington had been known in art circles for his terrible storage conditions and refusal to allow conservation work on his collection. For someone like James Morrison Hamilton, this would have been unbearable. "Did you know about the Wellington theft?" Jennifer asked directly. "Not at the time. Dad told me he was working on a large conservation project for a private collector. He was excited about it, said he was finally going to give some masterpieces the care they deserved. I assumed it was legitimate work." Sarah leaned forward. "When did you realize it wasn't?" "When the FBI came to our house in 1990. Dad had already disappeared by then.
He left me a letter explaining everything, how he couldn't watch beautiful art suffer, how he had found a way to preserve the Wellington pieces while leaving perfect replicas in their place. Jennifer's mind raced. He left replicas because he didn't want Wellington to know the originals were gone? Dad said Wellington cared more about owning the paintings than appreciating them. As long as something was hanging on his wall, Wellington wouldn't notice the difference. Dad wanted time to properly preserve the originals before whatever came next. What was supposed to come next? Sarah asked. Helen's voice broke. Dad planned to return them eventually. He was going to create a scandal, expose Wellington's poor conservation practices, and make sure the paintings ended up in proper museums where they could be seen and cared for correctly. But then the Alzheimer started. The tragedy of James Morrison Hamilton's situation became clear. He had stolen the paintings to save them, intending to expose the theft as a statement about proper art preservation. But his mind began deteriorating before he could complete his plan, leaving the paintings hidden and his noble intentions locked away in a diseased brain. "Where are they now?" Jennifer asked. "I don't know," Helen said, tears streaming down her face. "Dad was so paranoid about the FBI investigation that he didn't tell me. By the time his symptoms became obvious, he had already forgotten the location himself. I've been searching for 3 years, going through his papers, visiting places he used to work, trying to find any clue." Sarah studied the photos Helen had shown them, her photographer's eye catching details others might miss. "These workshop photos, do you recognize the background?" "I do. That was Dad's restoration studio. He rented space in an old warehouse in Queens, but I've been there dozens of times since he disappeared. It's empty." "Can you take us there?" Jennifer asked. The warehouse was exactly as Helen described, empty except for dust and memories. But Sarah noticed something others had missed. In her documentation of Jim's paintings from the hospital, several featured architectural details that matched the warehouse's interior: exposed brick walls, industrial windows, specific patterns of light and shadow. "Jennifer," Sarah said quietly, "what if he painted the location but we're not seeing it correctly?" They returned to the hospital, where Sarah laid out all of Jim's paintings chronologically. Viewed individually, they seemed like random landscapes and abstract pieces. But arranged in sequence, they began to tell a story, a visual map created by muscle memory that his conscious mind couldn't access. "Look at this progression," Sarah pointed out. "He starts with the warehouse exterior, then moves to interior spaces, then to what looks like storage areas. His hands are drawing a path to the paintings." Jim was sleeping when they entered his room, but Helen's presence seemed to stir something deep into subconscious. His eyes opened and focused on his daughter with surprising clarity. "Helen," he whispered, "I've been dreaming about you." "I'm here, Dad," she said, taking his hand. "Did they find my ladies? Are they still safe?" Helen looked at Jennifer and Sarah desperately. They needed to act quickly. Jim's lucid moments were becoming rare and brief. "Dad, where are your ladies?" Helen asked gently. Jim's eyes clouded with confusion, but his free hand began moving as if painting in the air. Sarah quickly placed a brush and small canvas within his reach. Without conscious thought, Jim began painting what appeared to be a detailed floor plan. "The sub-basement. Harold never knew it existed. The builder showed me during the restoration consultation. Perfect temperature, perfect humidity. They're safe there until someone can wake them up properly." The revelation was stunning. For 15 years, Larvorsmer have searched the world for the stolen paintings, never realizing they were hidden beneath the very mansion they had been stolen from. James Morrison Hamilton hadn't just taken the paintings, he had hidden them in the one place Wellington himself didn't know existed. "But that's impossible," Helen said. "The FBI must have searched that house thoroughly." Jennifer shook her head slowly. "Not necessarily. If the sub-basement wasn't on the original blueprints, and if Wellington himself didn't know about it, we wouldn't have thought to look there. The search would have been based on architectural plans that didn't show the hidden space. Jim's eyes closed and his breathing became steady. The effort of remembering had exhausted him, but his painting provided the clearest clue they had received. "Is Wellington still alive?" Sarah asked. "Died 5 years ago. The mansion is tied up in estate litigation. It's been empty since his death." Helen looked at her father's sleeping form, then at the painting that might finally solve the mystery that had destroyed their family. What happens now? Jennifer faced another ethical dilemma. Recovering the paintings would close the case and return invaluable art to the world, but it would also expose James Morrison Hamilton as the Wellington thief, destroying whatever remained of his reputation and potentially impacting Helen's life. "We go find them," Jennifer said finally. "But how we handle what comes after, that's something we'll figure out together." As they prepared to leave the hospital, Sarah noticed that Jim had painted one final detail in the corner of his canvas, a small signature that read, "For the love of beauty, JMH." Even in the depths of Alzheimer's, James Morrison Hamilton remembered why he had taken such enormous risks. It wasn't for money or fame. It was for love of art itself. The paintings had been hiding in plain sight for 15 years, but recovering them will force everyone involved to confront an impossible choice between justice and compassion. And Jim Morrison Hamilton's story is about to take one final heartbreaking turn.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The Wellington mansion loomed against the gray October sky like a monument to forgotten wealth. Built in 1925 by steel baron Harold Wellington's grandfather, the estate had been magnificent in its heyday. Now it stood empty, surrounded by overgrown gardens and legal battles between distant heirs who cared more about its monetary value than its history. Jennifer Martinez stood before the ornate front doors, search warrant in hand, accompanied by Sarah Williams, Helen Morrison, and FBI art crime team specialist Agent Marcus Rivera. The local police had already established a perimeter, though Jennifer doubted they would need it. If James Morrison Hamilton's paintings were accurate, they were about to uncover the art world's greatest hidden treasure in the most unlikely location. "I still can't believe they could be here," Helen murmured, clutching the hospital painting that had led them to this moment. "Dad searched this house for weeks during his original consultation with Wellington. How could he have found a space that wasn't on any blueprints?" Agent Rivera consulted the architectural plans they had obtained from the county records office. "These are from 1925. It's possible renovations were done later without proper documentation. And houses this old, especially ones owned by eccentric collectors, hidden rooms aren't uncommon." The interior of the mansion was a time capsule. Wellington had lived alone for his final decades, and the house reflected his obsessive personality. Every room was filled with art, antiques, and curiosities, but everything was covered in dust sheets, creating an eerie landscape of ghostly forms. They made their way to the basement, following the path James had painted in his hospital room. The basement was divided into several chambers: a wine cellar, storage areas, and what appeared to be Wellington's private viewing room, where he had displayed some of his less valuable pieces. "According to your father's painting, the entrance should be behind the wine cellar," Jennifer said, studying the small canvas. The wine cellar was impressive. Hundreds of bottles stored in climate-controlled racks along brick walls. But Sarah's photographer's eye noticed something others missed: slight variations in the brickwork that suggested one section might be newer than the rest. "There," she pointed, "that wall doesn't match the others." Agent Rivera examined the bricks more closely. "These are definitely different. Same style, but the mortar is newer, probably 1980s. He ran his hands along the wall, searching for any mechanism or hidden catch. Helen studied her father's painting more carefully. Dad painted something here in the corner. Looks like a wine bottle rack, but positioned differently than the others. They located the rack Helen had identified and found it could rotate slightly. When Agent Rivera applied pressure and turned it counterclockwise, they heard a mechanical click, and a section of the brick wall swung inward on hidden hinges. Behind the false wall was a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that emerged was cool and dry, perfect for art preservation. Agent Rivera led the way with a flashlight, followed by Jennifer, Sarah, and Helen. The sub-basement was far more sophisticated than James' paging had suggested. It wasn't just a hidden room. It was a professional-grade art storage facility. Climate control systems hummed quietly, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity. Soft LED lights activated automatically as they descended, illuminating a space that took their breath away. 15 masterpieces hung on specially designed archival mounting systems. Each painting was protected by museum-quality glass and positioned to avoid any potential damage from vibration or light exposure. The collection was arranged not for display, but for optimal preservation, exactly what one would expect from a master conservator. "My God," Agent Rivera whispered, "they're all here." Jennifer approached the nearest painting, Monet's Water Lilies and Evening Light, valued at over $8 million. It looked as pristine as the day it was painted, showing no signs of the deterioration that concerned conservators worldwide. James Morrison Hamilton had not just stolen these paintings, he had saved them. Sarah documented everything with her camera, capturing not just the paintings themselves, but the sophisticated preservation setup James had created. This isn't the work of a thief. This is the work of someone who loved these pieces more than life itself. Helen stood before a Degas ballerina painting, tears streaming down her face. He did it. He really saved them. But Agent Rivera was examining something that changed their understanding of the entire situation. On a small table near the entrance was a typed letter, sealed in a protective plastic sleeve. The letterhead showed it was from Harold Wellington himself, dated just 6 months before his death. "You need to read this," Rivera said, handing the letter to Jennifer. The letter was addressed to James Morrison Hamilton. "Mr. Morrison Hamilton, I know you have my paintings. I've known for years. What you don't know is that I'm grateful. When I hired you in 1987 to assess my collection, you told me my storage methods were damaging priceless artworks. You were right, but my pride wouldn't let me admit it. I was killing the very beauty I claimed to love. I discovered your theft 3 years after you performed it, but by then I had seen what proper conservation could accomplish. The forgeries you left were perfect, but more importantly, they showed me how these pieces should look when properly cared for. I spent years trying to find you, not to prosecute, but to thank you. My lawyers told me the statute of limitations had expired anyway. I wanted to propose a solution that would honor your work and make the paintings available to the world. Since I cannot locate you, I am leaving instructions in my will. Upon my death, this house is to be donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, including any artworks that may be discovered on the premises. I trust they will understand the extraordinary circumstances and ensure these masterpieces receive the care they deserve. You are not a thief, Mr. Morrison Hamilton. You are a guardian of beauty in a world that often fails to protect what matters most. Harold Wellington, 1999. The silence in the sub-basement was profound. Everything they thought they knew about the case had been wrong. Harold Wellington had not only discovered the theft, but had come to understand and appreciate James Morrison Hamilton's motives. "The will," Helen said suddenly. "Did Wellington follow through with his plan to donate the house to the Met?" Agent Rivera was already on his phone, checking with the legal team handling Wellington's estate. After a brief conversation, he hung up with a stunned expression. "The donation was blocked by the Wellington heirs.
They'd been fighting for 5 years to have the will overturned so they can sell the house. Wellington's lawyers have been trying to execute his wishes, but the family contest has kept everything tied up in court. Jennifer realized the broader implications. So legally, the paintings belonged to the Wellington estate, which Harold wanted donated to the Met. James took them to preserve them with Wellington's posthumous blessing, but the heirs don't know any of this exists. Sarah was still photographing, but her focus had shifted to documenting Wellington's letter and the preservation setup James had created. This changes everything, doesn't it? James wasn't just vindicated by Wellington, he was thanked for what he did. Helen picked up another document from the table, a detailed conservation report in her father's handwriting, documenting the condition of each painting when he took them and the preservation steps he had implemented. It was the work of a master professional, not a criminal. Dad didn't just steal these paintings. He created a time capsule, preserving them exactly as they should be preserved until someone could ensure their proper future. Agent Rivera faced an unprecedented situation. Technically, we have to treat this as stolen property recovery, but Wellington's letter and will create complicated legal circumstances, and your father's condition. Jennifer understood the dilemma. James Morrison Hamilton was dying, his mind already mostly gone. Even if charges could be brought, he was beyond prosecution. More importantly, his actions had been validated by the very man he had supposedly wronged. "What happens to the paintings now?" Sarah asked. "That's up to the courts," Rivera replied. "But Wellington's letter will carry enormous weight. He explicitly stated his wishes for these works to go to the Met. Even if the family contest continues, I suspect a judge will honor the original owner's intentions regarding these specific pieces." Helen looked around the sub-basement one final time. Dad always said that art belongs to humanity, not to individuals. He risked everything to prove that point. As they prepared to leave, Sarah noticed one final detail that James had painted in his hospital room, a small easel in the corner of the sub-basement. On it was a canvas showing a peaceful landscape, and at the bottom, barely visible, were the words, "For Helen, who understood."
Even in his confusion and memory loss, James Morrison Hamilton had remembered the most important thing: his daughter's love and support for his impossible dream of saving art from neglect and indifference. The greatest revelation is yet to come. James Morrison Hamilton's story has one more secret that will transform everything we know about love, sacrifice, and the true meaning of preserving beauty for future generations.
The ride back to Mercy General Hospital was silent, each person lost in contemplation of what they had discovered. The Wellington paintings were now in FBI custody, but the case had transformed from a criminal investigation into something resembling an art restoration project with legal complications. Sarah stared out the window, thinking about James Morrison Hamilton lying in room 314, unaware that his life's work had finally been revealed and validated. In a few hours, news of the discovery would break worldwide, but James might never understand what his sacrifice had accomplished. "I need to see him," Helen said suddenly. "I need to tell Dad what we found." Jennifer understood. He might not remember Helen. His condition has deteriorated significantly since this morning. "I know, but he needs to know that Harold Wellington understood, that everything Dad did was worth it." They found James awake but distant, staring out the window with the vacant expression that had become increasingly common. Helen took his hand gently, and for a moment his eyes focused on her face. "Helen?" he said, uncertainly. "Are you really here, or am I dreaming again?" "I'm here, Dad, and I have something wonderful to tell you." Helen began describing their discovery, the sub-basement, the perfectly preserved paintings, and Wellington's letter of gratitude. Sarah watched James's face carefully, looking for signs of comprehension. Initially, He seemed confused, unable to process the complex information. But when Helen mentioned the paintings themselves, water lilies in evening light, ballet rehearsal, the potato eaters, something shifted in his expression. "They're safe?" he asked, his voice suddenly stronger. "They're safe, Dad. More than safe. They're perfect." James closed his eyes, and for a long moment, Sarah thought he had fallen asleep. But when he opened them again, they held a clarity that hadn't been there in weeks. "Harold wrote to me," he said quietly. "Near the end. He understood." Helen exchanged glances with Jennifer. This was the first time James had shown any awareness of Wellington's letter. "You remember Harold's letter?" Helen asked gently. "He said I wasn't a thief. He said I was a guardian. But I was so scared, Helen. I thought I had destroyed our family." Sarah moved closer, recognizing that James was having what neurologists called a terminal lucidity, a phenomenon where dementia patients experienced sudden temporary clarity near the end of their lives. "Dad, you didn't destroy anything," Helen whispered. "You saved those paintings. Wellington thanked you for it. The whole art world is going to understand what you did." James turned to look at Jennifer. "You're the detective," he said with surprising accuracy. "The one who's been looking for the paintings." Jennifer nodded. "For 15 years, Mr. Morrison Hamilton. But I understand now that you weren't hiding them from the world. You were protecting them for the world." "I couldn't let them die," James said, his voice gaining strength. "Art isn't property. It's humanity's memory made visible. When we let beautiful things suffer from neglect, we lose part of our souls." Sarah found herself crying as she listened to this man, whose mind had been ravaged by disease, articulate a philosophy that most people never developed in a lifetime of clear thinking. "There's something else, Dad, something I never told you because I was afraid." James looked at his daughter with the full attention that had been impossible for months. "I'm an art restorer too," Helen continued. "I've been working at the Whitney for 10 years. I learned everything from watching you, and I've spent my entire career trying to live up to your standards." James' eyes filled with tears. "You followed in my footsteps?" "I followed in your heart, Dad. Every painting I work on, I ask myself what James Morrison Hamilton would do. How would my father ensure this piece survives for future generations?" Sarah realized she was witnessing something extraordinary, not just the reunion of a father and daughter, but the passing of a sacred mission from one generation to the next. "Helen," James said, gripping his hand with surprising strength, "there's something I need to tell you, something important." He struggled to sit up, and Jennifer helped adjust his pillows. The effort seemed to cost him, but his determination was clear. "In the paintings in the sub-basement, they're not the only ones." The room fell silent, and Jennifer felt her heart skip a beat. "What do you mean, Dad?" "Wellington wasn't my only intervention," James said. "Over 20 years, I rescued pieces from 6 different collections, always with the same principle. I left perfect forgeries in place and moved the originals to safety." Sarah's mind reeled. 6 collections? How many paintings? 47 pieces total, James said, with the precision that had characterized his professional life. "Where are the others?" Jennifer asked. James's clarity was already beginning to fade, but he made an enormous effort to focus. "Helen, in my old workshop, the one you couldn't find anything in, look behind the false wall where I kept my restoration chemicals. There's a safe. The combination is your mother's birthday." Helen gasped. "Mom's birthday? But Dad, I don't remember Mom's exact birthday. I was so young when she died." James's eyes grew distant, and Sarah feared we were losing him to the disease again, but then he smiled with a warmth that transformed his entire face. "June 15th, 1952, the most beautiful day in history, because that's when your mother came into the world." Helen was sobbing now, not just from grief, but from the overwhelming realization that her father, in the depths of dementia, had remembered the most important date of his emotional life. "In the safe," James continued with visible effort, "there are detailed records of every intervention, conservation reports, photographs, locations, everything needed to ensure the paintings can be returned to proper institutions when the time is right."
Jennifer understood the magnitude of what James was revealing. "You documented everything? Even knowing it could incriminate you?" "I documented everything because someday someone would need to understand. Art preservation isn't about ownership. It's about stewardship. I was never planning to keep those paintings hidden forever. I was waiting for a world that would understand the difference between possessing art and protecting it." Agent Rivera, who had been quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke. "Mr. Morrison Hamilton, this information changes everything. We're not just talking about one case anymore. This could be the largest art recovery in FBI history."
James looked at Rivera with an expression that seemed almost amused. "Young man, do you think I cared about making history? I cared about making sure that in 100 years, when you and I are dust, people will still be able to see Monet's water lilies the way Monet painted them." The profundity of that statement settled over everyone in the room. James Morrison Hamilton hadn't been driven by criminal intent or personal gain. He had been driven by a form of love so pure and selfless that it transcended conventional morality. "Dad," Helen said softly, "what happens now? What do you want me to do with this information?" James closed his eyes, and when he opened them, Sarah could see that his moment of clarity was ending. But his final words carried the weight of a lifetime's conviction. "Let the art live, Helen. Let it breathe and be seen and touch people's souls the way it touched mine. The details don't matter. The institutions don't matter. What matters is that beauty survives." Over the next few hours, James slipped back into the fog of advanced dementia, but his revelation had set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the art world's understanding of conservation, ownership, and moral responsibility. Helen led investigators to the safe in her father's old workshop, which contained meticulous documentation of what he had privately called the Beauty Project. Each intervention was detailed with scientific precision: original condition assessments, conservation work performed, storage protocols implemented, and even psychological profiles of the original owners that explained why James believed the artworks were being neglected or mistreated. The records revealed that James Morrison Hamilton had operated with a moral code that was both simple and revolutionary. Art belonged to humanity, not to individuals, and anyone who failed to properly care for cultural treasures forfeited their right to possess them. James Morrison Hamilton died peacefully 3 days later, with Helen holding his hand and Sarah documenting his final moments, not with a camera, but simply by bearing witness to the end of an extraordinary life. His last words were barely audible. "The colors, they're so beautiful." As the world prepares to learn about James Morrison Hamilton's extraordinary legacy, the true scope of his sacrifice will forever change how we think about the relationship between art, love, and human responsibility.
6 weeks after the discovery in Wellington's sub-basement, Sarah Williams stood in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, surrounded by crowds viewing the Morrison Hamilton Collection, an unprecedented exhibition of 47 masterpieces that had been hidden for decades, now revealed in perfect condition. The exhibition had drawn visitors from around the world, not just to see the art, but to understand the story behind its preservation. James Morrison Hamilton had died peacefully 3 days after his final lucid conversation, but his legacy was transforming international discussions about art ownership, conservation ethics, and cultural stewardship. Helen Morrison stood beside Sarah, reading aloud from the exhibition placard that told her father's story. James Morrison Hamilton, 1932 to 2023, dedicated his life to art conservation, ultimately sacrificing his freedom, his reputation, and his health to ensure that priceless cultural artifacts would survive for future generations.
His methods were unconventional, but his results were extraordinary. 47 masterpieces preserved in perfect condition through techniques that have advanced the field of art conservation by decades. The legal resolution had been complex, but ultimately satisfying. Wellington's heirs, faced with documentation of their ancestors' explicit wishes and the overwhelming public support for James's mission, had agreed to honor the original donation plan. The other recovered collections had similar outcomes, families and institutions choosing to donate the pieces to major museums rather than fight legal battles that would paint them as enemies of cultural preservation. Detective Jennifer Martinez approached them, carrying a folder that had become familiar over the past weeks, FBI documentation of the case that would soon be studied in law schools and art programs worldwide. "The final paperwork is complete," Jennifer announced. "The FBI is officially closing the case with no criminal charges. The statute of limitations, Harold Wellington's letter of gratitude, and the overwhelming public support have made prosecution impossible even if it were desired." Sarah smiled, remembering her first encounter with Jim Morrison in room 314. He would have been amazed by all this attention. "Actually, I think Dad would have been horrified by the publicity. He never wanted to be famous. He just wanted the art to be safe." Jennifer nodded toward the crowd surrounding the paintings. "Well, he got what he wanted. These pieces will never be hidden away or neglected again. The Met has committed to displaying them permanently and using them as the centerpiece of their new conservation education program." The exhibition had indeed sparked a revolution in how museums and collectors approached art preservation. James's meticulous documentation had revealed conservation techniques that were decades ahead of their time, and his philosophy of art stewardship was being adopted by institutions worldwide. Sarah's role in the story had led to unexpected opportunities. The Whitney Museum had offered her a position documenting the stories behind artwork, using her photography skills and nursing background to preserve the human narratives connected to cultural treasures. It was exactly the kind of meaningful work she had been searching for. "There's something else," Helen said, pulling out a small envelope. "I found this in Dad's hospital room after he died. It's addressed to you, Sarah." With trembling hands, Sarah opened the envelope to find a brief note in James' handwriting, though she couldn't tell when he might have written it. "Dear Sarah, thank you for seeing me when others looked through me. Thank you for listening to my hands when my voice couldn't find the words. Art dies when no one pays attention to it, but it lives forever when someone truly sees it. Keep seeing. Keep caring. The world needs more guardians of beauty. James Morrison Hamilton." Sarah felt tears running down her cheeks as she realized that even in his confusion, James had understood the impact of her attention and care. She had thought she was just doing her job, but to him she had been a fellow guardian of something precious. Helen took Sarah's hand. "You know, he meant that. In his lucid moments, he talked about you constantly. He said you had the eye of someone who really sees art, not just looks at it." "I'm just a nurse with a photography degree," Sarah protested. "No," Jennifer interjected. "You're the person who recognized that a confused old man might have something important to say. You're the person who took time to document his paintings when everyone else dismissed them as delusions. You're the person who helped us understand that James Morrison Hamilton wasn't a criminal, he was a hero." As they walked through the exhibition, Sarah reflected on how completely her understanding of heroism had changed. She had expected heroes to be bold and confident, making dramatic gestures that everyone could recognize. Instead, she had found heroism in an elderly man with dementia, quietly painting maps to hidden treasures while his mind slowly disappeared. The final room of the exhibition contained something that moved Sarah more than any of the famous paintings, a recreation of James's hospital room, complete with the small canvases he had painted during his final lucid weeks. These simple works, created by dying hands guided by muscle memory, had led to the greatest art recovery in history. Helen paused in front of the hospital room display. "You know what I realized," she said. "Dad's greatest masterpiece wasn't any painting he ever conserved or forged. It was the philosophy he lived by, that beauty is worth any sacrifice, and that protecting art is protecting humanity's soul."
Sarah thought about her own transformation through this experience. She had started as a discouraged nurse, feeling useless in her job. She had ended as someone who understood that caring for people, even people society had forgotten, was itself a form of art conservation. Every person carried irreplaceable stories, memories, and knowledge that could disappear forever if no one paid attention. "What will you do now?" Jennifer asked Helen. "Continue Dad's work," Helen replied without hesitation, "but openly this time. I'm starting a foundation that will help identify at-risk artworks and connect them with proper conservation resources. No more interventions, just education, support, and advocacy for better art preservation practices." "The Morrison Hamilton Foundation?" Sarah suggested. Helen smiled. "Actually, I was thinking of calling it the Guardian Project. Dad always said we're all just temporary guardians of the beautiful things in this world." As closing time approached, Sarah found herself alone with Monet's Water Lilies in Evening Light, the first painting she had recognized in James's hospital room descriptions. The colors were more vibrant than in any photograph she had ever seen, the brushstrokes more alive, the entire composition more moving. She thought about James's final words. "Let the art live, Helen. Let it breathe and be seen and touch people's souls the way it touched mine." Standing in that moment, surrounded by the tangible results of one man's extraordinary dedication, Sarah understood what James had meant. Art wasn't just paint on canvas or sculptures in marble. Art was humanity's way of preserving and sharing its deepest experiences of beauty, truth, and connection. James Morrison Hamilton had risked everything to ensure that these experiences would survive. He had sacrificed his reputation, his freedom, his family relationships, and ultimately his health. But in doing so, he had guaranteed that future generations would be able to stand where Sarah stood now, feeling the same sense of wonder and connection that had driven him to such extraordinary measures. The security guard announced the final call for visitors to exit. As Sarah prepared to leave, she noticed something she had missed before, a small placard beside the Monet that contained one final quote from James' hospital recordings. "Every person who truly sees a piece of art becomes its guardian. When you look at a painting and feel something change inside you, you become responsible for ensuring that others will have the same opportunity. Art doesn't belong to museums or collectors. It belongs to everyone who is capable of being moved by beauty." Sarah realized that this was James Morrison Hamilton's true legacy, not the dramatic story of hidden paintings and daring rescues, but the simple truth that caring about beautiful things and caring about the people who create and preserve them is one of the most important things a human being can do. As she walked out of the museum into the New York evening, Sarah felt the weight and joy of her new understanding. She was no longer just Sarah Williams, the discouraged nurse with an unused photography degree. She was Sarah Williams, guardian of beauty, protector of human stories, and living proof that paying attention to what others ignore can change the world. In her pocket, she carried James Morrison Hamilton's final note, a reminder that heroes aren't always the people who make headlines, but sometimes the people who quietly, persistently, lovingly protect what matters most until the rest of the world is ready to understand why it mattered all along. The memory thief had stolen nothing. Instead, he had given everything, preserving not just paintings, but the very idea that beauty is worth protecting, that art is worth risking everything for, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give future generations is ensuring they will still be able to experience wonder. Sarah's story began with a simple act of listening to a confused old man. It ended with the understanding that every human being has the potential to be a guardian of beauty, and that the most profound changes often begin with someone who simply chooses to pay attention when others look away. The legacy of James Morrison Hamilton lived on, not just in the 47 masterpieces that now graced museum walls around the world, but in every person who chose to see beauty where others saw only confusion, to find value in what society discarded, and to believe that preserving what matters most is always worth the sacrifice. And in a small art therapy room in a hospital neurological ward, Sarah Williams's camera continued to capture the final paintings of forgotten patients, documenting the last fragments of lives that might otherwise disappear without trace. Because she had learned the most important lesson of all, that every human being has the potential to be a guardian of beauty, and that the most profound changes often begin with someone who simply chooses to pay attention when others look away.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.